So the VA just released a major update regarding what's going to happen regarding buyer broker compensation. In this video, I'm going to be showing you side by side exactly what this whole update looks like. We're going to go over it together and we're going to break it down so that way we better understand exactly what is going on here. So, as you can see here, this just came out today, June 11th. We were expecting it to come out actually tomorrow, June 12th, according to the VA's last update that they gave us, but it came out a day early, which is good. So what does all this mean? The purpose for this was the VA is allowing a temporary local variance for charges related to buyer broker compensation to help veterans remain competitive in the housing market. What this all means is in the past, the veteran was actually not allowed to pay for their buyer broker compensation. It was required to basically be paid by the seller. But when this whole change regarding all of the class action lawsuits that took place with the NAR settlement and all of this has caused a major change to need to happen because now what's going to be happening is buyers can now be able to pay for their broker compensation, which means that the VA had to pivot in being able to allow veterans to be able to cover their own buyer broker compensation. The reason they needed to do this is because if they didn't make this change, well, it would only make it harder for a veteran to potentially be able to compete in a market like we're going to be in. So I'm going to break all this down for you guys in regards to what all this means and hopefully give you guys some better understanding. So this is going to be what I noticed is a local variance. And so what's coming of this is veterans can pay reasonable and customary buyer broker charges, including commission and other broker related fees. The other thing is the home must be in an area where the listing brokers can't set buyer broker compensation through the multiple listing service or where buyer broker compensation can't flow through the listing broker. So what do these two things mean? Well, one of the biggest changes in the NAR settlement is how the multiple listing service was being able to show exactly how much commission was going to be trickled over to the buyer's agent or buyer broker. Well, what's happened is now it's not allowed to be listed anywhere on the MLS. And so what's going to come from that is in what this is basically saying is if it is in a place or if you are in a local area where that is happening, then the veteran can now pay for buyer broker compensation. The other thing that it also says is if you're in an area where the buyer broker compensation cannot come through the listing agent or the listing broker, what does this mean? Well, in the past, historically, when you were buying a home, the commission always flowed through from the seller through the listing agent or the listing broker and then split. So here's what it meant. It was kind of more of like it always flowed to the listing broker. It never went from the seller directly to the buyer's broker. So think of it kind of like a straight down and across type of thing, like an L, right? The seller was basically going to compensate the listing agent, and then the listing agent was going to compensate the buyer broker, depending on whatever that agreement was, typically listed in the multiple listing service. Well, now that can't happen. It can't flow from seller to listing broker to buyer broker. If there is going to be a compensation paid to the buyer broker, it has to be basically stated that it's going from seller to buyer broker, and then whatever the seller was going to pay the listing broker, that same thing applies. So it's kind of more like a V now, or I guess an upside down V, versus in the past, it was kind of more shaped like an L, if that makes sense. So that's one of the major changes that we're going to see here. Now, with regards to the changes, also, the changes can't be included in the loan amount, which is good, right? Which means it doesn't increase the veteran's loan amount. I actually thought that was going to be one of the possibilities as to how they were going to do all of this, was as it was going to be rolled into the loan amount. The veteran's ability to close the loan must consider these charges, which means that the veteran must have enough assets to show in their file, similar to really anything else. It's for example, if a veteran decides they're going to put a down payment, even though they're not necessarily required with the VA loan, the lender is always required to just make sure the veteran has the assets there. If the veteran's going to buy their rate down or do whatever it is that they're going to do in the transaction, the veteran or the lender needs to make sure that the veteran has the funds there. So that one is a little bit more of an an obvious change to see there as well. There's no need for like an invoice or anything like that in all of this. And then some of the other things that they're also talking about, let me go down here for you guys, is let's see, where was it? Firebug conversation. Um, there it is. So it just needs to be listed in the sales contract. That's one of the other things that they talked about. And then in regards to the the compensation as far as how you're going to pay your agent, this is another big thing, right? So this is not a video to tell you guys you now have to pay for your buyer broker. That's not necessarily what this video is about. This is more just telling you that in certain instances, depending on the property, depending on what you're looking at buying, that may potentially come up and be something that you might want to do, especially to get that particular house. But what this is also encouraging you to do is to negotiate. And I think they even put that in there, like veterans, VA encourages veterans to negotiate the amount to be paid to the buyer broker, whether the veteran or seller pays the amount. That's extremely important as well. And I think that also is a great thing to highlight regarding the whole NAR settlement is part of what caused all of this is really the whole norm that we kind of lived in, which was the norm of interest, or sorry, the norm of commissions was 6%. The norm is 5%. And the problem with the norm was it made people feel like they had to pay this amount of compensation for the service. It doesn't make the amount a bad amount. It just kind of was more of like this weird unwritten rule. And that's a major problem. Even though it was never a rule, it felt like that to us consumers, like as if it was an unwritten rule. And because of all of that stuff that took place there, it's now caused the whole shift in these changes that we're talking about today, right? Why are we having to possibly pay for our buyer compensation? Why are we having to do it in this fashion? That's to encourage negotiation from day one, both as a seller selling your house and you're going to list your house with that real estate agent. You want to negotiate what you're going to list it for. It doesn't mean that you want to penny pinch or you want to nickel and dime and try to take advantage of the real estate professional. I'm not saying that whatsoever, but I'm also saying you want to know what services you're paying for or what services you're going to get for what you're paying for. And then as a buyer, if you're buying a property, it's knowing what services that you're going to get from your real estate professional to make sure that they're looking out for your best interests. So negotiating with them on whether or not they have a set amount that they're going to be charging is important because you're going to now be signing buyer's representation agreements that are going to list on there, hey, if the seller is not going to pay me this much money, you may potentially need to have to pay me this much money. So you're going to be signing those agreements. And those are things that you need to have conversations with your buyer's representation up front, not when you're making an offer on a house or not when you're already under contract for a home, because then you're going to find yourself being surprised for having to pay different expenses that you just shouldn't have to be worrying about, especially at that time. You need to know what you're going to be looking at going into all of this. So getting pre-approved up front is going to be extremely important, guys. Not getting pre-qualified. I think the term pre-qualified needs to go away in the real estate business. We need to be using the word pre-approval. We need to be looking at our whole situation, income, assets, liabilities, and credit to determine the overall risk threshold and the overall ability for you to be able to afford the home that you're buying. So that way you don't find yourself getting into a contract that you're just not prepared for. When it comes to the buyer's representation agreement, again, I just want to hammer this home really quickly. Negotiate with your buyer's broker or just have a very transparent conversation with your buyer's broker to understand that, hey, you know what? I know I may have to pay you 1.5% of the loan amount or 2% of the loan amount of whatever it is, or the sales price, whatever it is that I'm buying, but maybe I can't personally afford it. So I need you to show me properties that the seller is going to cover that. Or I need you to make an offer, no matter what, that states the seller is going to cover your compensation because I can't afford that. Those are conversations that need to be had up front to avoid you from having to pay for things that you're just not prepared for. Some important things to note here. In this circular, it clearly states that August 10th, 2024 is when this temporary change is going to go into effect. And the VA also said that they are working on a more permanent change to be going into effect from that time as well. So some things to be aware of are, if you are buying a house prior to August 10th of 2024, you should not be expected to pay for your buyer broker compensation. That should be something that you need to be aware of. If you are going to be buying a house after that, well, then you could find yourself in that situation to potentially need to pay for the buyer broker compensation. Another thing is the VA might announce their permanent change to all this before this August 10th timeline, which will be announced. And I will make sure that I make a whole video breaking that down for you guys. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date on all of this important change and important news. If you know a veteran out there that is buying a property in 2024 or even next year, share this video with them, because this is heavily going to affect a lot of people that are looking at buying a home. And we want to make sure that more and more veterans are protected and informed about all of this regarding the VA home loan benefit. My last thing for you guys, I appreciate your guys' love and support you have shown this channel, and I want you to know that Jesus loves you. I'll see you guys in the next one.